going up. Elevator Systems. Bowen Family Systems Theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, where we present Bowen Family Systems Theory ideas and concepts in brief and understandable ways. We're finishing out this season with 3 episodes on differentiation of self, which is the cornerstone concept of the theory. And today we will be discussing solid self and pseudo self. Dr. Carrie Collier is joining Katie and I again. Carrie works as a researcher, lecturer, and family therapist specializing in Bowen theory and earned her PhD in counselor education from the George Washington University. Carrie is on the faculty and board of directors at the Bowen Center and also served as the director there for 2 years. She has published and validated a family unit functioning questionnaire, which is used by therapists and researchers to gather information about families, and recently published on the language of nature in Murray Bowen's archival papers. Carrie grew up in Tennessee and currently lives in Northern Virginia. So glad to have you back, Carrie.
Thank you.
Do you want to get us going with your elevator pitch on solid self and pseudo self?
Yeah, I mean, like so many of Murray Bowen's concepts, this is sort of a part of another concept, which is differentiation of self, which is really important to know. And he would say at one end of the scale would be, this level of solid self. And at the other end would be this level of pseudo self. Pseudo self, I think about being sort of the fake self, if you will. So I remember the F, the fake self. And then the solid self is the sort of real self. And the solid self is who you are, your sort of being, and however you would think about that. Some people might think it's their soul and it comes about over your lifetime. So maybe you try certain things and no way, I'm never doing that again. So it's sort of what you live or die by. But they don't have to stay the same. You can reason and do research and be thoughtful in your decision-making process. So whereas the pseudo self borrows from others, and he liked to use that word, and it's part of this sort of lending of self and taking of self, because his whole theory, right, is about differentiating a self. And so the more you're sort of borrowing and lending and sharing ideas and going along with the group for this sort of calmness, then the less you're differentiating, right? And all of this has to do with your level of differentiation and one's ability to be able to differentiate and live, his or her life goals. And so a fake self would be the one that merges with an intimate partner, a marriage partner, or relationship partner. He would say that those are the two pseudo selves blending and borrowing, and that there would be levels of it. And so there would be this sort of, intermingling of pseudo selves to go along, to think alike, to be alike. And with that, you're losing differentiation of self. So I'll stop there.
Great. Katie.
Thanks, Carrie. I think that was a good. So I tried my best with a metaphor today. So thinking about this concept, one thing I wanted to start with is just saying that I always think of solid and pseudo self in the context of relationship and embedded in all these other concepts, which Carrie did a great job of explaining. So I said, I think my solid self is the hardworking, well thought out side of me. So I'm going to compare to trees today. So like a tree that does not move in a storm, a tree that stays solid when challenged by the environment. It's kind of that really base, well-rooted sense of me. Whereas my pseudo self is the part that I can borrow or lend to others. So I appreciate that pseudo self can look like different things. And I've taken my tree metaphor further. So it can be the lichen that grows on the tree, that they have this mutual relationship of borrowing and sharing. It can be the tree that holds up a fence, so the fence doesn't fall over. And it can be the tree that is easily knocked over in the wind. So it, might join in another tree. I think there is an element where trees can pretend to be like other trees, but I would have to do my research on that. Kind of blend in. I know there's animals that can do that, can kind of fake being another species, like birds. I know there's a type of bird that can do that. So I think that, again, Carrie did a good job of saying that solid self is the things that I have thought through, kind of, I always say what I'm willing to do and not willing to do, what I believe, that isn't changeable when faced with others. I've heard other people refer to it as like kind of the ideas you would be willing to die for, and I think that's a good way to say it. And again, I think this is a very natural process. So I don't think that I'm thinking always a lot about that pseudo self decision, but I think it happens quite automatically in groups. So there's my O. Dixie, what have you got?
Yeah. Mine is solid self and pseudo self highlight what is or isn't negotiable in relationships and the big and small ways people adjust or shift based on real or perceived pressure from others. This could be something like swearing less when your grandparents are around. And are you doing this out of respect, or are you pretending to be someone who doesn't curse? It can also be things of serious importance, like politicians and leaders who abandon principles for the sake of votes or the strong influence of investors. And the concept also describes how much people can rise and fall based on the opinion, praise, or censure of others. So someone with more pseudo self can experience life as a roller coaster, rising and falling. Whereas a person with more solid self will be steadier, both in their view of themselves and their ability to stick with principles. And then from Dr. Bowen, he says, another important part of the differentiation of self has to do with the levels of solid and pseudo self in a person. The solid self says, this is who I am, what I believe, what I stand for, and what I will or will not do in a given situation. It's made up of clearly defined beliefs, opinions, convictions, and life principles. They are incorporated into self from one's own experiences by a process of intellectual reasoning and the careful consideration of the alternatives involved in the choice. The pseudo-self is created by emotional pressure and can be modified by emotional pressure. The pseudo-self is a pretend self. It was acquired to conform to the environment, and it contains discrepant and assorted principles that pretend to be in emotional harmony with a variety of social groups, without selves being aware that the groups are inconsistent with each other. The pseudo-self is an actor and can be many different selves. The list of pretends is extensive. You can pretend to be more important or less important, stronger or weaker, more attractive or less attractive than is realistic. And it's pretty easy to detect gross examples of pretense, but there's enough imposter in all of us that it's difficult to detect lesser degrees of the imposter in others. It can be difficult for the actor or for others without knowledge of emotional systems to know the dividing line between solid self and pseudo self. And also that you can conform by going along or getting really reactive in opposition. So many things I could say. But what do you guys notice? And actually, can I be Katie for a moment? How does one look at this neutrally?
There we go. Was that pseudo self borrowing from me? No.
Because I know my automatic pseudo self, but I mean, adaptation in the group is something useful for survival. But yeah, what do you notice?
Well, I think what you just talked about, Dixie, was his sort of, what I always remember in Bowen theory is that he's always talking about realistic versus fantasy. I think that's a really important concept. And I think it's, the conundrum is, how do you know when you're being a real self? You can get really caught up in, am I being real? Am I being fake? And I think that is what sort of differentiation of self is about, is being clear about who you are and what you've borrowed. And I do think that takes observation and time and looking and sort of, taking it down a few notches in the world. I think and really looking at the reality of what you've decided and what you're up against. I mean, pseudo self borrows ideas and can intellectualize it, but it hasn't really been, thought out. And it's more for the relationship focus, the decision that you make. And so I think that this idea of reality versus fantasy comes into play in so many of the theory's concepts.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the element of anxiety in this when Dixie was giving her pitch is, how this can vary based on the level of chronic anxiety in the system, but also acute anxiety. How I might reach to my sisters when I need to borrow a little self from them. I'm feeling unsteady, and I might reach out and say, I need to be firmed up a bit. I had a supervisor once observe to me that when she was watching tape, that she would notice that when I got anxious, or her question was, when you get anxious in a session, is that when you go up on the board and teach something? It just is another way of just borrowing some ideas, that I think there is a way that this does help steady people, and that can't, here's my neutrality pitch. It's not always a bad thing, right? I think that we do need to steady ourselves through situations sometimes. So, I think, but the worthiness of examining that piece of what is solid in us. I just was going to listen to a podcast just last night of Wiser Than Me, where Nancy Pelosi was giving advice about what kind of kept her going and what would she tell her younger self. And she said, know your why, which I was thinking about in the face of this episode this morning. Is I think it was like, know your solid self. What is the reason? What are you grounding your belief system or thinking on that's guiding your actions? So I guess that would be another way that I would be thinking about it. How do you get clear in what it is you do believe, what you're willing and not willing to do?
Mm-hmm.
I've certainly noticed in work with clients that people can be very articulate about how their partner would define what being a good spouse is, or they imagine that they're accurate, or they spend a lot of time thinking about what their partner, how their partner would define that, and how do we think about it for ourselves, and how do we think it for ourselves in a I forget what that game show was in the 80s where you go in sort of like the cone of silence for a little while. How do you think about your own principles without automatically, oh, but they would say that, or they would disagree with that. And taking time to define.
Yeah. What is the impact, or what are the benefits of differentiation of self? I mean, if pseudo self is keeping everybody happy and going along, what's the risk? I mean, I think that's what Bowen's big thing about differentiation of self is. Why is it so important? I think he did have to convince people that it was really important to be a self, or you would get lost in the emotional amalgam of the family. I mean, he talks about sort of when you get locked into those fusions and there's too much pseudo self going on, and you have that level of pseudo self, where that's what's operating, then you get these families or people that are just numb. They're not even really looking. There's like this emotional blindness. They're numb. They're not even looking to love people and get approval. They're just kind of, out there in fantasy land. There's not really this reality that they can even engage in. But his belief was the more that you would differentiate away from that amalgam, then the higher functioning a person could be.
I have clients come in and talk a lot about this in the face of social media. How to figure out and get solid in who you are in the face of all of this potential pretend self, right? This image of this is what a person is when you watch 20 seconds or a photo of them on Instagram, or any social media platform, and thinking about, how challenging it is for an individual to figure out who they are. And in the face of that, how do we kind of figure out who the real selves of both the person and then the people we're looking at? And so I was just thinking as I entered this, as just that's an extra challenge, I think. I mean, maybe there was a form of that in the past that I can't think of, but I think it's really there is really validation given in these pretend selves, I think, now.
Yeah, I think there is an energy. I think there is an energy with the likes, having all the likes and not the likes. And so I think that is that energy from pseudo self that really can take over. And how realistic are we? How aware are we that that's what can guide us in our principles?
Yeah. What examples come to
I
mind?
have I think what one example that I hear quite a bit can be when a couple is together, maybe married or partnered, and one person wants to shift jobs or change jobs. And he or she has a sense that the partner, will not like this, will not approve, whether it's for political reasons, whether it's because of a move or an impact on time. And how does this person um, get sort of the facts, get realistic, not sit in the fantasy of maybe I just want this job because it looks good or it defines me, or is this really my life goal and purpose? Is this really something important to me?
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a useful one because I think that the challenge of solid self in that example, Carrie, would be the pushback they might give. If a client, if one member of the partnership says, I don't want this high level job, I want to work, less, I want, do less. And that would be a challenge to the relationship potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's not best for the family.
Mm.
How does one determine that? How does one? I mean, I don't think it's the content or the problem that defines what it is. I think it's just how the family deals with it and how the person comes up with the choice. Is it out of fear because the partner will not approve, or is it going against the partner? Right. Like one of the definitions that were written in Bowen's book, it can either be going with or maybe purposely going against.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a movie example.
Yeah, go ahead.
I thought about Mean Girls.
Mm.
And the reason I thought about Mean Girls is I think that the challenge where once, and I don't know the characters' names, I'm sorry. So once once the Emma Stone character who realizes she, is, trying to infiltrate this popular kids group, feels the benefit to being popular, feels the good, and begins to go back on her principles. I think that was just an interesting way to watch kind of pseudo and solid self interacting in a person. And then in the end, she finds a way to say, what are my principles? By being reminded, I think she's given information from other people. But I thought it was a way to watch how, even the mean girls per se are borrowing to feel a sense of belonging, to feel a connection to others. So I thought that movie has lots of different examples where you can begin to watch kind of the interplay of solid and pseudo self. So that was my movie that I came up with.
Yeah, peer pressure is definitely one of those words that comes to mind about this, or wearing a mask. And it'd be nice to have that end when we turn 20, but does not.
Yeah.
I had quite a different fictional example, Katie. I chose Pride and Prejudice.
Oh,
And there's a great quote. So, spoiler alert, I don't know, maybe, but most people know the story, I think. But
I think by now it's okay to spoil Pride and Prejudice.
250 years later. Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy are sort of the two contrasting men. And someone says, poor Wickham, there is such an expression of goodness in his countenance, such an openness and gentleness in his manner. And then, because these men grew up together, there was certainly some mismanagement in the education of these two young men. One has got all the goodness, and the other all the appearance of it. And so, highlighting that difference of one looks really good, but is not, versus authentic kind of principles and goodness.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times people will ask, well, how do you figure this out? What's the work that you do to try, to figure out where does one start, and I think it is the observation and the examining of one's own parental triangle and the family of origin work that Dr. Bowen talks about, which is sort of engaging important others in the family to learn about self, to learn about the role that you played in your own family. He talks about in, more pseudo self relationships where there's a lot of it, which he says the average person has more pseudo self than real self. So we're not working with much here.
Yeah.
So you're overlapping, and then he says something like, in a marriage, when there's a lot of pseudo self involved, there will be one person that will rise up as the functioning one, and then the other one becomes the functional no self. Well, that doesn't sound like fun. So you've got these two choices, and I know they're all on a continuum, but I just think that's interesting that the functioning becomes a no self, and he used that word a lot, where you're just kind of going along for the ride, and then the other person is dragging. Maybe I think that shows up in a lot of the people that come to me for marital challenges, and so I do think the work is in the extended family, Bowen would say, going up and looking at, did your family of origin look like that? Where was the borrowing and giving up of self going on? And do people even know that or see that?
Yeah, and then once you can see it, I always think that this is a concept that I watch in Bowen theory, where once you see it, you can't unsee it. And beginning to look around and really seeing all the places where maybe I agree with things I don't really agree with, or, don't speak up if I have a different thinking in my family, and watching that. And, I appreciate your punch up around looking at the extended family. I find when I'm working with couples, just getting interested in how their parents' marriage functioned or how they function in that relationship to their parents is quite useful information.
I mean, I think about overfunctioning, the over under functioning reciprocity in a marriage, and how much of overfunctioning and underfunctioning is pseudo self. Of just of doing for the other, or seeing the other. You're not seeing the other in a realistic way. You're seeing either over or under adequacy, and so then you're relating to that person out of that fantasy, and then you're doing or not doing or allowing them to do, and that is the fusion or the pseudo self.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Carrie, that punch up about, I don't think I heard that as clearly, this fantasy reality. I think of the reality needs, but I don't know that I'm always thinking of the opposition of that, which is that I'm acting on this idea of a fantasy of what person's functioning is. So I appreciate that distinction in my brain.
I heard a quote in the movie The Two Popes that is just like stuck in my brain the past few weeks. Anthony Hopkins' character says, "No, I've changed. Compromise is something else." And I just keep thinking, how do I know the difference between, I have like in your pitch, Carrie, I have thoughtfully thought through these options, or I am compromising to reduce my anxiety or make another person feel better, which then makes me feel better. And it's so subtle. It's like at Christmas this year, I told my husband, I really like watching movies, but because our kids we live so far apart, we don't have time for movies. We got to do something real. We got to play games and talk. And I'm like, okay, we'll play games then, right? Even though one of my sort of bonding things would be sitting there together watching movies. So it's not always these big ethical choices. It's these subtle little ways we don't maybe put in our perspective.
And that's where I'm interested in your thinking, each of you, on the choice in this, right? I think that there is times in which it's adaptive to have a choice. Would you think of that as pseudo self? Your example right there, I chose to do something different that might keep my husband calm or keep the family calm versus I'm doing it automatically. How I don't know. What are you thinking on that? Would that be differentiation or is that pseudo self?
Well, it depends on what she was thinking after it. If she belabored over it and thought, oh my God, and then got mad and why did I do that? I think that could be a sign of giving up self or losing self. Or I noticed I did this. And so next time, and maybe putting it on the table for the family, I noticed that I did this and this is what happened. And I sort of lost the essence of what I like. So next time I'm going to try to get in here and do this. And so then you're putting that, emotional amalgam on the table, you're smacking it down there and saying, this is what it is. This is the reality of what happened.
Mm.
Not the fantasy of everything's just going to go along because we don't want to rock the boat so I think it's how you deal with it. It happens, it happens. So what are you going to do? Are you going to put your head down and do it again? Or are you going to define a self and say, I noticed that this happened. And so next time I'm going to do this.
And I would say for me in that example, I probably other years wouldn't even have noticed that I was going along because it's just the way I operate. Maybe you get a little bitter, occasionally.
That bitter. Yes. And
Yeah.
that is giving up self. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good reminder for me, or that rumination you talked about, that rang true over in my side over here.
Because that puts something in the system, right?
Yeah.
Then you're
Mm-hmm.
you're feeling bad about yourself. You're undervaluing yourself. That's part of pseudo self. You're undervaluing yourself or overvaluing yourself. But in this case, I think it's an undervalue of mom gets a say.
Yeah. Which I think my other example that I thought of when you said that is I was with extended family over the summer and they were talking politics and I had a different view and I thought about it. I sat there, I listened, I observed myself and I thought, I'm not calm enough to enter this conversation right now with thoughtfulness. And so I chose not to say anything. And I think didn't ruminate about that afterwards. Looked for opportunities to share my thinking more one-on-one with people later, which I thought was, that example came up for me when I was thinking about what you said, Carrie, that was different.
Yeah, I think the layers of fusion, especially in parenting.
Yeah.
Parenting, there's a lot of parenting stuff that comes to my work. And I think especially in parenting, there's so many layers. There's the extended family work of the parent. There's the triangles there that are going into the parenting. And I just think this comes up a lot for parents. And, how do you parent? What's the right way to do it? And I think trying to do, differentiation of self work or family of origin work can, give parents a leg up on how to do this. It's not a self-help book. It's not easy.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
There are a lot of examples in parenting. For example, in my household, it was sort of a school decision. Do you do private or do you do public school? And so it can matter, where the parents sit with that, or maybe how they grew up, and maybe how their parents view public versus private school. And then how do you go about getting the reality of your situation, assessing your child, learning the facts about what is the best opportunity for your child or not, and then making the decisions based upon that. Not, oh my gosh, my parents are going to freak out if we don't do this or we do this, So, and there's just so many.
Yeah.
And then add in your peers or your community organizations or
your work.
Yeah.
Your neighbors.
Yeah.
Keeping up with the Joneses, right?
There we go. We could probably think of all those things.
Well, take away resources, ideas, other. I would say Bowen's book, page 364 and 365. I think you read some of it. I think Dixie might have read some of it. So that's where I would go. And any of the videos on the Bowen Center website, his Chalk Talks.
Yeah.
My takeaway is this. When I thought of this concept, I thought of Shakespeare. You thought of Jane Austen, I thought of Shakespeare, and that famous soliloquy of, right, all the world's a stage, all the men and women merely players. They have their exits, their entrance, and then it says a one man in his time plays many parts, and then it goes through all those parts. And I thought, look at all Jane Austen's time, Shakespeare, we're thinking about how we function in the world. And one of the ways that I thought the Shakespeare quote was useful, and I found this really beautiful, that hopefully Dixie, I sent her, Benedict Cumberbatch did this soliloquy really beautifully, that hopefully if people are bored and want to watch it, it's really useful. How are we functioning on our stage? How are we, when are we more solid? When are we playing a part? Just one way that people can look at their way of showing up in the world. I think with the acting, right? What is the fantasy? Carrie's idea that she brought forth for me. What's the reality? So that would be the thing for people to think about, is I'm putting a little Shakespeare in their minds.
Well, and even using that word acting, right? Like in my mind, it implies like almost like intentional deception. But I think this is deeper than that. I mean, I could give so many examples of all of my pseudo self, but it's not always like some willful, I have to fit in. It's just, it happens. I don't know. Do you guys have thoughts on this intentionality, deception?
I
Are
think it's
those maybe not
instinctual.
helpful words, or does it speak to intensity?
I think it's instinctual. I think a lot of what happens is instinctual. And I think that's why Bowen said the average person has more pseudo self to work with than solid self, because that was sort of his saying, was that the emotional part of us takes over a lot more than we give it credit. And so I don't think it's purposeful. I think it is instinctual. And I think it comes down from the multi-generational transmission process. What do you have to work with? What's your level? Go ahead, Katie.
And what's the story in the family? I mean, part of what I liked about the quote is really he goes through each stage in a person's life. Really, he's talking about, first we're an infant, and then we're a school child. He talks about males, so he's saying a schoolboy, and then I move into the lover. And what is the story in the family? What is the emotional process in the family about how you function in those roles? Right? I think that that's one way to think about. And does that fit for you? So in a romantic relationship, in marriage, how do you think about how you function there versus what might be the automatic or the pretend that you've been communicated and has been communicated in the family throughout the generations? How we age, right? I think there's a lot of ideas about how we age. And that's why, I appreciated kind of thinking through each stage of life and how do I want to approach that stage? I've heard some people put out there, right? How do I want to age? How do I think about that? What are my beliefs about aging?
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I was thinking if we could have David Attenborough just narrate our life, and the human female puts on lipstick to...
I'd probably fall asleep. I'd fall asleep with his voice.
Well, my takeaway was in Kathleen Smith's book, Everything Isn't Terrible. She has something called the brick wall exercise, where you draw a brick wall, and each brick is an achievement, a title, or experience that you've built your sense of self on. And when you look at that, how many of those bricks are dependent on people's responses to you versus your own sort of intrinsic passions and interests. So I thought that was a useful
challenging exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyone have anything else to
The only other
throw in
thing
here?
I would add would be, Bowen theory too is about learning it for yourself and not just intellectualizing and hearing. And I think Bowen stood by that, which is why he told people to do their own family of origin work, to do the work, to work on differentiation of self, and not just to use it in your practice, but to do it yourself so that you are operating from real self and not just what you're hearing your colleagues. So
That's
Erase
such a
all
good
of what I just
example.
said and figure it out for yourself.
That's a good example. How many people, including myself, who work with this theory, borrow from Bowen?
Hmm.
When do I do
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Or from the other people that are talking about it. Where's
Yes.
that togetherness? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
My asking the Katie question at the start of the episode. Yeah.
Yeah. Lots to think about.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode, Carrie. It was great to have you here.
thank you. It was a great Friday.
Yeah. And I hope our listeners have found some useful things to think from today. And just like Carrie reminded, this is a reminder for myself as much as our audience. Can you focus less on being a solid pseudo self-detective in others and be the most curious about yourself? And what do you notice in you as you go out into your relationships? This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.